Dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure to see you back to the America House. I'm Katya Smadli and I'm director of the Kyiv Institute, Kennana Institute Kyiv office. We have a great pleasure to have a guest from Odessa tonight, Mr. Volodymyr Dubovik, who is an associate professor of the Odessa State University. He is a director of the Center for International Studies at the same university. He had been at the Kennana Institute twice, in 1997, on a short-term research scholarship.
3 months.
And later he became a recipient of the very prestigious Fulbright Award, and he had the chance to spend more time at the Kennana Institute. I think that time he spent 6 months.
Right.
6 months.
Right.
And today he will speak on a very unusual and untypical subject for Ukraine, the development of the civil rights in the United States. You know that there are a lot of African Americans nowadays in government of the United States, but there are a lot of challenges which are still faced by the black population in the States, and Volodymyr will look at both aspects of this historical movement. Volodymyr, the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you so much, Katya. Well, thanks to America House for hosting my talk here today. I would like to spend some time with you today speaking exactly about that. The place that belongs to events at Sельма, little town in the state of Alabama, that took place 50 years ago, 1965. And that actually led to the historic landmark act being signed by President Johnson the same year, 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that being 50 years now this year, it obviously brings our attention to this subject. As Katya has mentioned already, I am primarily doing foreign policy, international relations research, but also I've been studying this subject for a number of years, fascinated by this subject of civil rights movement in the United States. It's an interesting subject. It's an ongoing project, and I will try to divide my time here with you today into two portions and two halves. Initially, I'm going to spend some time with you showing where Sельма fits in the context of these events of the civil rights era, and then actually showing what happened since 1965 in terms of African Americans being involved in life of the United States and how they continue to struggle with certain issues, but at the same time there's been a lot of progress and advancement for African Americans as well. Now, Katya has mentioned already, and it's not difficult to notice that now we have, the Americans have a black African American president, and Mr. Obama has always been very appreciative about what's been done by previous generations of African Americans to make that possible. Now here there is a nice calendar that you have of Mr. Obama. You have various quotations by Obama from various points in time that he made, and specifically here in the year of 2004 he made a major speech which made him a star actually at the Democratic Convention in Boston in the summer of 2004, and I'm going to quote you from that speech. He says here, "I stand here knowing that my story is part of a larger American story, that I owe a debt to all of those who came before me, and that in no other country on earth is my story even possible." So Mr. President is very much appreciative of what has been done by previous generations of African Americans in their civil rights struggle. Now, where do we start? There are obviously different departure points. We can go all the way back to the times when African Americans were brought forcefully, kept enslaved in the United States. We can start with Civil War. Perhaps we can start with abolitionist movement and so on, and people like Frederick Douglass, who was a major abolitionist as well. But we'll probably jump a little bit to this. I want to start this talk with mentioning briefly the turn of 19th and 20th century and two major figures which played a role in the movement, because actually there was a beginning of an awakening of a political movement of African Americans. One of those figures is, you can see his figure on the screen right here. It's William Du Bois, who was a major figure and founder of National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was formed in 1909. Now, that organization was a major, and still is, a major organization in the field of African Americans fighting for their rights. So the next picture, that's not in order. I wanted them to be shown. Let's see. Some of them missing. Well, anyway, the next major figure was Booker T. Washington as well. I had his picture somewhere in the files, but it's just not coming up on the screen for some reason now. Who was a major educator, and he was the founder of so-called Tuskegee Institute for the Negroes in a little town Tuskegee in Alabama as well, now called Tuskegee University. His idea was different from Mr. Du Bois, whom you've seen before. Du Bois was basically talking about political emancipation of Negroes. So he was having these ambitions about African Americans becoming actively involved in the social and political life of society, while Mr. Booker T. Washington was very much limited in his ideas. He was basically talking about Negroes having good education and having a chance to get a good job position. That's it, no political ambitions and so on. So therefore, no wonder that Mr. Washington was very much accepted by ruling white political class of the United States of those times. For instance, he was the first African-American, first black person ever to be invited for a dinner in the White House by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1901. But then we would come back in the course of my talk today. Those different directions and those different groupings and fractions within the African American movement persisted and multiplied, ranging all the way from those who were praising this accommodation with whites, and then on the other extreme flank to the people who were actually praising this idea of radical movement and actually taking guns in their hands and fighting the white people for their liberation and something like that. So we're going to come back to that as well. One of the major issues, of course, for the black movement, African American movement, the more politically correct would be say African American, but actually blacks are more frequently used now actually than they used to be years ago. A lot of activists in the African American movement actually saying, well, we are black, so you're not really insulting anyone of us by saying that we are, but by calling us black. So excuse myself as well, switching from African Americans to black sometimes. Historically, everyone was calling them Negroes. Now that's kind of unacceptable these days, but when we get back to those things that took place like 100 years ago, then you hear people calling them Negroes. Even those who were sympathizing with the movement, they were calling them Negroes, and was no other way. Now, the major period in time when the civil rights movement was really booming and accelerating and moving fast and was between 1954, obviously, and 1968. That was the definitive era of the civil rights movement. In 1954, you had a major decision by Supreme Court, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, where you had abandoning of any segregation within the schools. Because that's what the world in the South of the United States was at that point of time. Segregation of everything, not just the schools, but every walk of life, every realm of life that you would have in the South, you would have it segregated. And segregation was presented by many defenders of the system as a good system, as a fair and just system, as not as discrimination as it actually what it actually was, but as a way of just getting separate ways for two major groups, whites and blacks. But of course there was a discrimination in place, and one of those fields was education. So education was 1954 decision by Supreme Court. It doesn't mean that it was like done. The schools were segregated, desegregated, and everything was fine ever since. No, people had to fight for it. And the first generations of African Americans going to desegregated schools, they suffered very severe and poor treatment, like this girl in this picture who is mocked, and then there's also a person to the right of color to the right of her. They are mocked by white crowd. Often people were throwing objects into them and so on. So it was an act of personal heroism just to get to school every day on a daily basis. So we need to remind ourselves about these difficult times, because right now it seems to be, even for Americans, taken for granted. Here we have another picture of a fellow of color sitting in the corner of the classroom. All right, everyone who's white sort of in the middle, and then he is in the corner. So it's a desegregated school, right? He's sitting with them in the same room, but on a separate piece of territory or land in this classroom. So that's another thing. Oh, come on! All of these pictures of mine are just in strange order. Now here you have the Little Rock Central High School in the town of Little Rock, which is the capital of, in the state of Arkansas. You have this Little Rock Central High School, which was the center of attention in 1957, because it was decided that kids of color can go and take classes in the school, but everyone of a white color was preventing them from doing that. And therefore you had 9 people, Central High 9, trying to get to the school. But all the way until President Eisenhower sent troops to help those people get into the school. Imagine the situation. The National Guard was unreliable because Eisenhower discovered the National Guard would follow the commands from a state governor. State governor was a supporter of segregation of the schools. So he was actually instructing National Guard to prevent those kids from going into the school. So the 101st Airborne was sent, the army was sent into the Little Rock to help those kids to get into the school. And you see that school here. And I will try to restore the order with my slides here because they have been carefully put in a chronological order, and that's not what it is right now. Anyway, I'm going to skip some of those then. There is one here. 2 years prior to events in Little Rock in Arkansas, there was a Montgomery bus boycott movement. Hi, George. In 1955, there was someone named Rosa Parks, whom we all know, and she might very well be soon appearing on a $20 note. There's a discussion now in the United States about introducing finally, better late than never, a woman's face on one of their denominations of the dollar note. So there will be a woman on a $20 note, and so far it seems that Rosa Parks is most obvious candidate. A great person, initiator of a Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. She refused to give, as we all know, refused to give her seat to the white guy, and then she was arrested. And of course, a lot of people were saying, well, she was just tired because she was working several jobs like many African Americans did, or any working people for that matter did in the South. But that's not true. Of course, she did it on purpose. She was deliberate in doing this act of courage, personal courage, and she was a leader of local Montgomery chapter of National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and that's why it was not mistaken or some kind of accident. She knew well what she was doing, and she's often now referred as a mother of a civil rights movement. But of course, you cannot just pin it down to one person. It's a number of people. But she was really actively involved in many ways. Now here you see another nice picture here of Rosa Parks sitting in the bus. Right, Rosa Parks sitting in the bus. That's an iconic picture of her. This one that you see on the screen is one of iconic as well, very well-known picture. I don't know which particular one they would choose when they decide what to put on a bill, on a dollar bill. Right, and then the other things. There's beautiful reproduction of a painting by great American painter Norman Rockwell, who had this great gift for generations, actually for decades when he was around, to capture the spirit of debates in the country. And that has something to do, I'm gonna probably just pass it around the hall. That has something to do with this desegregation of the schools. You have a little girl, it's a little bit of exaggeration really, but you have this little girl, a black girl, going to the school, and you have 4 federal marshals, U.S. marshals, are accompanying her just to get her into the school. And then of course on the wall you have the saying nigger. So that shows you it wasn't easy, all right, but it was done, and it took a lot of effort. Now Rosa Parks is a charismatic figure, iconic figure. She's legend. She passed away now, obviously. Now you see here on the screen the museum, Rosa Parks Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. They produce a lot of interesting materials. You can find out more about Rosa Parks. They produce materials like this one, for example. It's a calendar as well from Rosa Parks Museum. This one is for 2011, where you have on each page you have some story about a particular person which took part in the civil rights movement. That's an interesting calendar as well. I can send this around as well. But the Montgomery bus boycott was a smart move, obviously, because it was something that you would harm white supporters of segregation with, because it has an economic effect. Because the people, by boycotting the bus system, they were causing a lot of harm to people owning the bus companies. For more than a year, people in Montgomery were walking, of color, they were walking the streets instead of using the buses, or using their own cars to give each other a ride. And that was something that was really had an effect on the community. And finally, the people lobbied by the owners of these bus companies to do something about it. And then the segregation on buses was stopped. Another way of segregation that they fought against was, of course, the segregation of restaurants and food counters. And here you see the picture of a famous sit-in in a little town, Greensboro, North Carolina, in a Woolworth's department store. You have fellows who are coming in and sitting in. Why is that something that should surprise us in a new way, or why we should bring our attention to this? Only because they were not allowed to sit there. It's a counter, the food counter for the whites. But they are there because they're demanding their rights. They want to be served. These people bought some stuff, they bought some clothes and everything in various shops within Woolworths, and then they come to the food counter and they say, we need our drinks, we need our food, but they denied this kind of thing. This is the time when you have the civil disobedience movement growing, when you have this idea of Mahatma Gandhi and others being put into place in American South. You have organizations like Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, for instance, one of the major organizations behind that. You have a lot of different ways how people of color and also their supporters among whites are fighting this segregation. This one is a sit-in, obviously. This one took place in 1960. That's the most famous sit-in, even though there have been many others. Another side of segregation was segregation on transportation. And in 1960, there was a law banning segregation on interstate travel. So within particular states in the South, you still cannot travel together, blacks and whites. But if you're black and if you're traveling between different states, you can sit together with the whites. That what the ban applied. But yet the people were denied from doing that. So in 1961, they had a bunch of freedom riders coming mostly from the north, both blacks and whites, deliberately sitting on the bus together, mixing, and trying to implement this new law into practice. And that was a hard thing to do. In Anniston, Alabama, this particular bus was firebombed. Luckily enough, miraculously enough, people were not harmed. Then they were also beaten severely by the bus stations, both in Montgomery and Birmingham, by white mobs. And the guy, the infamous Bull Connor, he was given this nickname not for a reason. A stubborn supporter of segregation in the South, head of public safety commissioner in Alabama. He was deliberately saying his guys in police not to intervene, and he would give time for white mobs and Ku Klux Klan people to attack freedom riders. You have one of those pictures. This one is taken by me, where you now have some information about what freedom riders was all about. There was a severe beating of them both in Montgomery and Birmingham. Now, further down, there were the other forms of struggle. And the struggle for desegregation of the schools continued. Here you have James Meredith, who became a student in 1962 of the University of Mississippi. Now that caused a riot, okay? The federal marshals that came to help Mr. Meredith to get to his classroom were not enough. 28 of them left the place with gunshots, okay? 160 people were wounded. So the army again was sent in. National Guards in the states, like I said, was not reliable all the way until on federal level it was decided that they would be actually reporting to president and not to governors of particular states. So that was a big deal, this Ole Miss University, it was a riot, and a lot of people suffered in those riots. The struggle continued, and you had in 1963 the focus was shifted to the city of Birmingham, also in Alabama. You had a so-called Children's Crusade. You know, the leaders of African American movement of civil rights, they decided it's not enough for us grown-ups just to be in the struggle. We need to use children. Cynically enough, you might say, but they understood that how it would look on the screen in the newspapers when the police would attack little kids, and that exactly what the aim that they had for them. It did work. You know, it was actually looking terrible when in 1963 they used those attack dogs and water hoses attacking those kids. You have this memorial monument in the middle of Birmingham where you have police dogs, and it's quite an experience still, you know, knowing that those dogs are not alive, you know, just to walk through. That's the whole idea of this monument. You walk in between those, and you feel what those kids might have felt at that point of time back in 1963. Now, from Birmingham, we can move we actually stay in Birmingham for one more, perhaps the most tragic event in the history there of the civil rights movement, or one of those at least. Here is the 16th Street Church, Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, where the bombing took place in September of 1963. Someone, and those people were found and persecuted to a certain extent at least, planted bombs on this side of the church, and that exploded at the time when younger people were in the church, and 4 girls were killed. The 4 girls were killed, and that was one of the most tragic accidents within the history of a civil rights movement in the United States. You have, well, not large really, but you have 4 pictures of those four girls. Now you have also across the street from the church the Birmingham Institute for Civil Rights. Here is Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery, Alabama, where Dr. Martin Luther King, now he comes into play, was preaching for a while, and then now we're getting to Selma events. The Selma events in 1965, obviously March of 1965. The major events took place here at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Ironically enough, well, like everything in the South, most things in the South, named after a Confederate general fighting on the side of the South in the times of Civil War in the middle 19th century. But now the country, 100 years later, you know, almost exactly 100 years later, was in some sort of civil war as well. You know, it's interesting enough how that's happened. That all happened specifically exactly 100 years after the Civil War was over. And here we have the cover of the magazine Life about Selma. You have troopers here, policemen, I'm going to send it around, waiting for the crowd of African Americans trying to cross the bridge. And it says Civil Rights Face Off at Selma, Savage Season Begins. You can take a look. There were actually three marches. Why the marches were needed? Those were the marches for the voter registration. In many ways, Selma was American Maidan, okay? Definitely close to what we had with the first Maidan, 2004. People fought here for their votes to be recognized against the falsification. And in that case, in 1965, in Selma, Alabama, they fought for voter registration because the voters, blacks were not allowed to vote, really, or register to vote. There were all sorts of artificial barriers made for the people to register to vote. So Dr. King and others were moving into this fight to make a march, attract attention. We're living in a different era now. You can get an attention for this kind of thing, with newspapers coming in, with TV crews coming in, and that was his intention. You can see some of the founders of this movement or initiators of the movement in front, John Lewis and Josiah Williams as well, and they are moving there. There were first marches, 3 marches. First one on March 7th, 1965, was the most dramatic one. That's the one which is called Bloody Sunday, all right, or Blood Sunday. I mean, in many countries you would have Blood Sundays. You would have one in Northern Ireland. You have one with the Revolution in 1905 in the Russian Empire. This case, Blood Sunday, when police attacked the people who were in the march. Many of them were bloodied. No one died, but a lot of people got a lot of injuries among the marchers. Now the second march was on March 9th. Mr. King was among the marchers, but at some point of time he decided to turn the crowd back towards Selma instead of walking towards Montgomery. The idea was to walk to the state capital, Montgomery, and that's 54 miles, which is almost like 90 kilometers. But the idea was to march there and demand the voting rights for the people. And here you see the final march, which took place on March 21st, when there was a huge crowd. But at that point of time, several thousand people, some say almost like 20,000 people marching, and the tension was there. And also President Johnson at that point of time, he had to act, and he sent troops and policemen and FBI agents to help to restore order. And that's why that march was relatively mild and no victims really, except for the others. And I'm gonna go back to this, who were killed not in the march itself. Now you have me on the bridge. Anyway, you have a picture, nice picture of them marching. Dr. King and Reverend Ralph Abernathy. Apparently it's a nice weather, late March, and also he is even having time to go through the last newspaper and get the news and what news coverage you have. So it is indeed a new era. Why Selma mattered, I've mentioned already. It showed the strengths of the African-American civil rights movement. It did show that this movement in the South is not isolated anymore to the South itself. That you're talking about South suddenly becoming in a prime of attention or limelight of American society. People are caring and paid attention to what's going on there. So it's not like old South way of doing things where you can do things in the shadow and nobody else notices. People notice around the country. And the TV era mattered as well. Just a few years prior to that, you had famous first televised debates of candidates for the position of president as well. So the TV was coming into people's lives. And then when you had police attacking innocent people, not putting any resistance, not armed obviously, and just blooding those people and injuring and wounding those people, that had a lot of impact on public mind and public psyche in the United States. And that changed it a lot. And also around the globe, frankly, because American leaders at that point of time, sitting in White House, were kind of worrying about what kind of effect that would have on the image or reputation of the United States around the globe. You know, definitely with administrations of John Kennedy, but also later of Lyndon Johnson, there were these concerns, like how does it play out? You know, we're kind of trying to present this image of a country which is based on human rights. And then all of a sudden, like, it seems like not everyone in this country has those rights. Like President Johnson, I think I have a quote here. Actually, President Kennedy, he said at one point of time, is our land a land of free except for the Negroes? You know, that was a question. And they were trying to intervene here. Prior to Selma, there was a march in Washington, an important event back in 1964, when Martin Luther King had this famous I Have a Dream speech and so on. But going back to Selma, important event clearly led Mr. Johnson, President Johnson, to signing this Voting Rights Act of 1965. Here is a table where the desk where he actually signed a law in real life. The American presidents often signing major documents or major laws. They use in different pens, and then they give it as a gift to some people who are involved. In this case, you can actually take a look at the actual desk, and it's in the Lyndon Johnson Library in Austin, Texas. That's funny, that you can actually see. Interesting that you can actually see the table. Now you have Mr. Johnson and me. Now, of course, all of that came not without fallen heroes, and I would like to bring at this point of time your attention to the fact that not only blacks were injured or killed. A lot of whites, progressive whites, liberals coming from the north, from all over the country actually, not just from the north, but also from Midwest, some from West Coast as well. They felt like they need to take part. Here you have this picture which is really known in 1964. Oops, what happened here? Right, it's back. Okay. In 1964, as they came, it was in an operation called Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer, and they came and they got killed. There were two Jewish boys from New York, Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, among the black guy, James Chaney, who were killed together. All right, so there was struggle. It wasn't struggle anymore about just whites and blacks getting, about their own ways in separate manner. It was actually a joint struggle now, and others were fallen as well. If this thing works now, there is someone who died at Selma. Not in the march, but in between marches, he was attacked by the white mob and killed. He was a reverend, he was a preacher, he was a churchman. His name was James Reeb. He came from Boston, and he was killed in between second and third marches in Boston. I mean, from Boston, but in Selma, and others as well. There you have. Oh, Jesus! You need to turn it around, I suppose. A little bit. Let's see. Here you have Viola Liuzzo, who came. Liuzzo, Americans would say Liuzzo. She came from Detroit. She was a mother of 5. She was active in the local trade union movement. And yet when she saw the first march being beaten by police, she said, I'm not going to stay here, I'm going down there. So she took her car, and it took her 3 days to get there. And she took part in the march, and she also, when the march was over, she was actually carrying people back to Selma in her car. That's when the car was attacked by Ku Klux Klan people, and they shot her twice in the face, so she was dead. This mother of 5, a great woman, Viola Liuzzo, she's buried right there, next to the road, in the middle, somewhere in the middle between Selma and Montgomery. I was shown this place where she is buried by the bus driver. I was taking the bus. You know, it's a hard thing to study these issues, not being able to drive. I'm not driving, so I was taking the bus from Montgomery to Selma, and the local driver lady there, a black lady, she knew that I was interested in this subject matter, and she stopped the entire bus for me to walk outside, and she pointed me, and I walked outside, and I looked at this nice memorial in the place where she is buried, Viola Liuzzo. They decided to not bring her back to Detroit, to her family, that she should be staying there, in a place, in the land where she came to help people, to fight for their cause. And I think it's quite touching. You know, and of course the movement went on, so the Selma didn't end it all. Here is a Ebenezer Church in Atlanta where Mr. King, now King of course, now Dr. King, Martin Luther King, is now the major figure, obviously, in the movement in the second half of the 1960s, even more than ever. So the entire focus is on him for what he did in previous years already, for his part in bringing about the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He was already given a Nobel Peace Prize, for instance. So he was a major figure of international scale, really, not just someone who was doing things in the South with the African-American movement. And when Mr. Johnson signed this law on voting rights in 1965, he was mindful of what it's going to do to his party and political situation within the United States, because the South was primarily the social base, electoral base for the Democratic Party, the party that Mr. Johnson represented, and he was known for saying to many of his advisors, I'm signing this treaty now because, I mean, not treaty, but the law, because I have to do that. I feel like I must. But we are losing the South as Democrats for a generation. And it turns out it's not for a generation. The South has never been coming back, really, in massive numbers, with few exceptions. It's not anymore, since 1965, a social electoral base for the Democratic Party. It's shifted elsewhere, right? So, but anyway, going back to Mr. King, he's now in Atlanta. He is now doing a lot of things in Atlanta, but he's living in this house in Atlanta. I took that picture with his family, big family, Coretta King, lots of kids. But then he got killed, of course, in 1968. And prior to 1968, there were other unwelcome developments. There was a radical movement, as I said earlier in my talk, getting up in full gear. A lot of people among the African Americans were saying, we're not going to wait till whites give us our freedoms and our rights. We're going to fight for those, and we need to use violence. And there was there was a Watts riot in Los Angeles in 1965. There was a major riot in 1967 in Detroit, which actually started white people moving out of downtown of Detroit destroyed, and that process was going on for years then later on. But then, of course, there was in 1968, April 4th, when Mr. King, Dr. King, Reverend King was shot dead on that balcony. He was standing there with his immediate friends and associates, and he got killed. And also that led to riots in more than 100 American major cities, with most severe riots actually taking place in the federal capital, Washington, D.C. Here is a view from within the hotel, from the room actually that Dr. King occupied. So somewhere there, there was a shooter, there was a sniper who killed Mr. King. Obviously, there was no protection. You know, he wasn't president or anything. So that guy just got his rifle and killed Dr. King. And that was a major event. I mean, he really gave his life for the cause. I mean, it wasn't lost. You know, it was really moving the movement further. But we're going to stop here in terms of a history of the movement, because this was a major event. I mean, you have this guy who was only talking about emancipation by peaceful means, by non-violence, maybe civil disobedience, but no more than that. And he was gunned down in the prime. All right, he was less than 40. How was he? I think he was like 36 or something. I couldn't remember now. So he was gunned down in prime of his time, of his life, and so on. And that was a severe event, and that actually woke some people up. The same year, actually, another important murder, of course, took place of Robert Kennedy as well in Los Angeles. He was a major supporter of desegregation, and he was a big friend of African-American civil rights movement, obviously much bigger than his elder brother John Kennedy, because John Kennedy was also vacillating in his position on these issues, and he was also needed to be pushed in his back to do something for the civil rights of the blacks. But Robert Kennedy was, since the beginning, more of a person who was attuned to the needs of the African-American community in the country. And by 1968, he was definitely the major supporter of desegregation. But then he was dead as well a little later that year. But going back to Dr. King, that's a funeral hearse that you can see in Atlanta, which was used, a primitive, on a purpose, a primitive hearse, which was used to bury Mr. King. There you have a tomb for Martin Luther King, and since 2006 of his wife, Coretta Scott King. And there you have a legacy, a most recent memorial, the only one in the National Mall area in Washington, D.C., obviously, which is not dedicated to a president, to a particular person, but not to a president this kind. This memorial is for Martin Luther King. A nice memorial here as well. Legacy lives on. Here is in Atlanta, one of the institutions that was formed by Dr. King, called Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. Now, not everyone agreed, as I said, with Dr. King on nonviolence. Here's one example, obviously Malcolm X, someone who was suggesting that other ways should be taken and chosen for the African Americans to fight for their rights. Fight without quotation marks, actually physically fight for their rights. Eventually, he actually a little bit changed his position, and he, to understand his position, you should remember the name of his most famous essay, perhaps, that he penned, that he published. It's called A Ballot or Bullet. You know, he was basically talking to the white people in the country, saying, give us our rights, give us a chance to decide everything through ballot, voting ballot, or there will be violence, because the people are fed up, the people had enough, so there will be violence by us, by the blacks, inevitably, and there will be bullets, so there'll be shooting and something like that. So Malcolm X was shut down himself in 1965, even prior to Dr. King. They never worked together really. They just, it's not that they didn't like each other, but they were not presenting the same view and position on these positions. Now, another guy here is Stokely Carmichael, one of the major figures in the movement among the radicals as well. He was one who coined the term and actually initiated the movement called the Black Power. So the actually militant blacks who were arming themselves, who were preparing themselves for the struggle, for the physical struggle with the system, which was oppressing African Americans. And he was a major figure there. And obviously the most well-known among those radicals were people in the Black Panthers movement. Now here's the founder of the Black Panthers movement, Huey Newton, who was a major figure in that particular movement. So the Black Panthers made themselves famous, obviously, in 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico, where two of the members of the movement, or at least sympathizers with the movement, they performed the salute, which is in Black Power, Black Panthers style, when they were receiving their golden and bronze medals. The interesting thing, actually, which was just found out basically several days ago, there was a major article on a person who was actually standing here, and he received a silver medal. Someone with the last name Norman. He was Australian, and he supported those two black guys. And he actually wore a pin, that he is supporting this Black Power movement and so on. So when he got back to Australia, thinking about this transnational effect or impact of this whole thing, he was actually censored by his own sports authorities, and he was prevented from taking part in any sports activities, international activities ever on, because a lot of people in Australia thought that was inappropriate for him to show his position in this domestic American issue, and he supported them. And now he was actually quite a tragic life. Interesting story. Several days ago, I don't remember which newspaper, one of those major newspapers, New York Times or Washington Post. Now, the movement went on. The Black Power, I think it's one of my last slides at least. I bored you to death perhaps with those slides. I'm going to stop here, even though we're not going to be talking right now. That will be the last thing I'll be talking about today in my actual talk, about the Charleston Nines, the people who were killed quite recently in Charleston Church, one of those historic churches in downtown Charleston, South Carolina. What happened to Black Americans since Selma, since 1965? Well, the number of them is growing. We all have almost 40 million of those within a nation of about 300 plus million people. That's a sizable amount. Percentage-wise, their proportional place is growing as well. They're almost 13% now, growing. Not the first non-white major community in the United States, Latinos, Hispanics are, but still getting there. And as we know, America is changing, demographic is changing, and the country will be primarily non-white quite soon. By the middle of this century, they say, non-whites would outnumber the white people in America. There are many blacks or African Americans who are involved in political life on local level in the South. There were mayors. There was, for instance, the guy whose name was Andrew Young. Well, he's still around. He was mayor of Atlanta, one of the first black mayors in major American cities. He was also appointed by President Carter to represent the United States as a head of a mission of the United States in United Nations. You had other people. You had people of color. Obviously, you had Colin Powell, first black to be head of chief of staffs. Then you had Colin Powell, also the first Secretary of State, obviously. Then you had, obviously, Condoleezza Rice quite recently, who was both Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. Susan Rice now, another Rice, right, who was also representative in the United States, in United Nations, and now a National Security Advisor under President Obama. President Obama himself, some figures in a judicial branch of power. The major one was Thurgood Marshall. He was a justice in the Supreme Court for a number of years, between 1967 to 1991. Now there is also one, Clarence Thomas. Ironically, though, he's one of the most conservative members of the Supreme Court, so he's not siding with liberal progressive movement at all in most of his judgments in deliberations within Supreme Court. In the cultural life, Americans were present. Historically, for some point of time, it was seen okay for African Americans to entertain the whites. Okay, so they had roles with movies, in some movies, comedies, stand-up comedians, and also in sports. But even there, it wasn't easy. Even, let's say, take the movies. It wasn't easy for them to break through. We can remember The Gun with the Wind and this, famous Mammy who was portrayed there by Hattie McDaniel. Hattie McDaniel was prevented from attending the premiere of this movie in the city of Atlanta back in 1939. How about that? She is one of the major characters. Producer David Selznick, he fought to the last minute for her to be there. No, the people, the mayor and others in Atlanta said, if you're going to have her there for the premiere and reception later, we're not going to have it. We're just going to have riots. We don't want this trouble. And then Clark Gable said, I'm not gonna go. But then they talked to each other, and she said, you should be there. It's a big movie. It's fine with me. And she actually appeared a little later at the Oscar ceremony in the more liberal West Coast, California, Los Angeles, where she received the first Oscar ever given to the person of color for the best supporting role. But anyway, it was a major achievement as well. So she got what she deserved. With sports as well, we can remember Jackie Robinson, who was breaking these racial barriers, the major baseball players, legendary number 42, who was whistled against, who was actually attacked and insulted and assaulted in so many ways, but he persevered and he changed the attitudes. We can remember Muhammad Ali, and even before him in boxing, Joe Louis, a major figure, transformative figure, who gave inspiration and hope to Black Americans, African Americans, that you can achieve things through hard work, and specific, and even transnational impact in a way, because his most well-known fight was against Max Schmeling, who was a darling of Hitler Germany, and he defeated Schmeling, at least in one of those major bouts, major fights. So he's shown to the world what African Americans can do. And then in the basketball, Bill Russell, for instance, take Boston Celtics, and not just any team, but Boston Celtics, which is based in Boston, which has a lot of history of trouble between whites and blacks, lots of riots actually, but he was the first one to appear on a major NBA basketball team in the starting line 5. He was the first one to appear as a coach of color in the NBA. He refused to play in several places where hotels were still not desegregated. He just said, I'm not going there. And a lot of people on the team said, we're not going either. So that was actually leading the struggle. So not even in the culture, not even in the movies, not even in sports, you had it easy. In movies as well, there was a major figure, Sidney Poitier. He's still around. He's 88 years old now. Who can forget this movie, Guess Who Is Coming to... Was it lunch or dinner? Dinner tonight. About the black guy who is suddenly a boyfriend of this white girl in this well-to-do family, and no one knows until he comes in, and everybody in the family sees that he's actually black. So that's kind of a surprise. And that's Sidney Poitier. So he's a major figure there as well. The troubles that we have, it's not all success, obviously. You have a lot of troubles with African Americans that are still persisting, not so much in the way of segregation anymore, discrimination, but more of a social, economic issues as well. In years since Selma, the blacks developed in many ways. They decided to find out more about their roots in Africa. And now what science can do for you, through DNA tests, you can even find out which particular part of Africa you're from. A lot of people change their names and religion. Many of them become black Muslims, adherents of the Nation of Islam movement, just to reject the religion and a name that was given to them some generations ago to their family, but their masters, by the slave owners. So that was also a major way to fight back. That's how Cassius Clay became Muhammad Ali, for instance, and some other, Malcolm X was involved with Nation of Islam as well. Seen some sort of radical movement now within the spectrum of African American civil rights movement, but anyhow, that was an interesting thing. A lot of blacks are now these days wearing on a daily basis, but definitely on festive occasions, African garb, African clothes, just to reflect their roots within Africa, because as you remember, as Bob Marley once sang, stolen from Africa, right, and brought to America. That's how it happened, and that they remember this now. There was this attempt to continue the extent of interaction and desegregation in the field of education. For instance, there was this affirmative action policy, which is a positive discrimination. That's an interesting thing. I just looked it up on internet, and that's how I say what is affirmative action. It's a positive discrimination, so discrimination can be positive. Obviously, the policy which was aimed at creating a little more better and favorable conditions for people who not belonging to the white racial or ethnic group within the United States. So that also included not just blacks, but also Asians, Latinos, and Native Americans as well. So affirmative action, controversial policy, sued in courts many times, because a lot of whites were saying basically why our kid is not getting to the college, because there is a black kid who probably has worse marks or lower marks, but he's getting in because of of this affirmative action. So that was controversial, created some controversy in the country, but I think it was a major thing. Then there was the busing for years, the busing policy, referring to the policy where you would have kids in the white neighborhoods being brought by the bus to the public schools in the predominantly black neighborhoods, and vice versa. So the kids would interact in schools on various levels. Again, controversial, but in many places it's still going on, and others it's not going on anymore. But there were some, they were looking in the United States, our friends in the United States, they were looking for some ways to foster and facilitate more interaction. And what's a better way to start than for the kids to start? Because it is known now for psychologists and social scientists, they tell us kids don't know color. But when the kids are in the young age, when they interact with each other, they're not even paying attention, are you black or are you white? So it grows into you with education and social influences and family and other things when you're getting older. So that's interesting. So why don't you start indeed with the younger age and make people interact while they don't even care about racism, because they don't even know what race is. One of the major problems obviously is that the education level is still low with the African Americans. I have some figures here. You probably heard those figures or something like that. With education, I actually don't have figures, but there is a vicious circle there. You have a lot of people of color who are coming from poor backgrounds and of very difficult circumstances in their families, not being able to pursue education, dropping out quite often. There is a huge gap in a level of dropout from schools and colleges by whites on one hand and then blacks on the other hand. And that's leaving them in a situation where they don't have education, they couldn't get a job, so they would go into the criminal activity, and that's how this vicious circle gets on and moving in cycles like this. So it's when you hear that a lot of criminals with black color of skin in the United States, that's true, but that's not how they were made or how they were born. That's a result of the social processes or difficult economic processes that they find themselves in. There is a high rate of incarceration for blacks in U.S. They are about 60% of inmates in U.S. Well, actually, a lot of people are. More than 2 million of people are in jail in U.S. on a day, on more or less on an average basis. 60% of them are blacks. So I told you it's just 12% of population, but that 60% of them, 5 times more, they constitute what number of people in jails. 1 out of 9 blacks between ages of 20 and 34 are going to jail. 1 out of 9, quite high, as you can see. I can remember one personal conversation with a taxi driver in Washington, D.C., and he was talkative, and he talked, and I listened, and he mentioned his son, and I said, "What is your son doing?" And he was like that. I would never forget that. He was like, "What do you mean he's doing? What a young black man can do in this country? He's going to jail." And that stuck with me, And that's a generalization, obviously, because there are many young black men who are not going to jail or doing quite fine. But still, that was some kind of a episode that shown to me that how widespread the problem is. Yeah, actually, with unemployment here, there are figures right now. The unemployment figures for the entire country is 5.5%. For the blacks, it's 10.2%. All right, so for the country 5.5, for the blacks it's 10.2, so it's almost double. All right, if we generalize, it's kind of simplified a little bit. It's double. All right, so that's a big thing. That's a big thing. And then with getting back to the prisons, there is a movement for prison reform. And there is a movement also to create some kind of alternatives to imprisonment, which is a big deal. If that goes somewhere, there are many NGOs involved in this particular field, because there are a lot of people who are in jail for petty crimes, for minor crimes, for not major crimes, but yet they spend time there, and many of them are coming out of those jails, like it is in any other country, really, be even worse, being ready to commit another crime. So why don't you send them to prison? Why don't you send them instead? Why do you have to send them to prison? Why don't you send them instead to some other ways that they can actually pay this back to the society for their crimes that they committed without actually spending time in jail or in prison? So that's a big thing. Another thing, of course, is gentrification. I mean, we all know that historically, in U.S., the people were always moving around. Now, a lot of blacks are normally in big cities would live in downtown areas, in urban core, they call it, or inner cities, they call it, and whites have moved more out into neighborhoods, into suburbs, more affluent suburbs and something like that. So that gentrification is still going on, where you have a historic black neighborhood, and then all of a sudden it's got this hipster reputation and more favorable and fashionable and trendy for whites to move in. So they would move in because they have better levels of salaries and wages and so on. And then they were moving out those blacks, and that creates a lot of problems. And then most recently, and I'm going to conclude here, obviously there are cases when unarmed blacks are shot, either by police or, say, if we remember the case of Trayvon Martin several years ago, actually, time flies fast. In 2012, he was killed in Florida by unarmed white neighborhood watch person. He got acquitted. I mean, that was just a poor representation, I think, on the part of his on the team which was representing Trayvon Martin and attacking the Zimmerman guy. But anyway, even in New York City, in more liberal cities, you had for years this stop and frisk policy, where you would have policemen stopping the cars without any reason, really, just to perform a basic search on people who are in the car. And obviously, most often than not, you would have this happening to African Americans. And then look at what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, quite recently. Michael Brown got shot. Not someone who was an angel, someone who was quite possibly committed an act of theft quite minutes before he was shot dead by policemen. But anyway, unarmed, and anyway, someone who didn't deserve to die, in the hands of armed policemen, and many other things. So there is this Black Lives Matter movement right now in the U.S. reflecting on this case of a lot of blacks being killed by excessive force being shown by police officers. The Black Lives Matter, I mean, it's a controversial movement as well. Just found out that yesterday another cop, a black cop in this case, was killed in the city of New York. And what do you think a lot of people who are activists in the Black Lives Matter movement did? They celebrated the death of a police officer. Don't matter that he is black. All right, but because he is a pig, as they say, quotation marks, he's a police officer, he's an enemy. So they just went to the hospital where he was dying and died eventually, and they were clapping in the streets and singing songs and basically, celebrating this. So it's controversial. Like I said, all sorts of people who are more conciliatory, who are consensus driven, oriented, and there are radicals as well. People who are fine with this having some kind of a fight or civil war or something like that. Like the guy who killed, the Dylan Roof. I mean, I would rather not mention his name, but well, I did already. He killed those 9 great people in a church, historic church in downtown Charleston. He was motivated by hate, but in U.S., of course, the specific case, unlike in many European countries, hate speech in most cases is fine. You cannot bring someone into jail or accuse because this person is just saying things like, I hate Negroes. I think they should rather be all dead. I would like to see them being killed. For that, it's on the margin somewhere. You're getting in risky territory with statements like this. But until you actually get a gun and you go to kill someone and you're caught in the act of doing this, you're fine. You're fine. So that's how it's going on. So it's very important to monitor those movements. Extreme white power movement, white domination movement, white movement, people who are radical whites, and that's what one of this magazine is doing. You can take a look as well. Intelligence Report is a great source. It's produced by one of those major institutions in the South, based in Montgomery, Alabama, called Southern Poverty Law Center. And they produce intelligence report. They monitor, they track all of those radicals, all sorts of radicals, not just white nationalists or supremacist radicals, who are bringing attention of the society, of the police, and so on. So things like this one in Charleston, South Carolina, could be prevented. Because if you raise an alarm, if you ring an alarm, you would probably be bringing attention to these people before they commit some atrocity. So that's what these people are doing. So it's this interracial problem is still there. The progress has been made, enormous progress since 1965, but there is a lot of work to be done ahead for the American society and our friends in the US. And this is still being an inspiration for many of us around the world. We'll look at the stories from 1954 to 1968 and since 65 and 68 at what is going on in the US. And you see this great American experiment, and you see this working progress, and you see that they're getting somewhere. Not everything is fine. You know, you have a lot of cruelty and violence still around, but they are moving forward, and that's. I think it's an interesting subject for us to consider if you look at the American history and today of America in American society. Thank you. Right.
Thank you, Volodymyr, for an excellent presentation. I myself was absolutely impressed by the civil rights movement when I was in the city of Atlanta at the Martin Luther King Memorial. It's an absolutely moving episode in the American history, and I remember at that time when we still experienced the black days of President Yanukovych's rule, I was thinking, you know, and being inspired by a totally peaceful protest that this movement was able to achieve, and was thinking that a lot of mechanisms of civic protest could be kind of imported to Ukraine in this regard.
Right.
And I think that the Maidan as a revolution of dignity was also a demonstration of the same peaceful protest which had inspired so many people globally. So thank you again for this very beautifully made presentation. Does anyone have questions from the audience?
Some time, I suppose.
Yes, we still have like 5 minutes.
I covered a lot of ground, so I probably talked for too long. I apologize. You know, it's us university professors. We kind of get to do this until someone actually stops us. You know, we talk and talk. That's what we do. You know, and they pay us. Not much.
I don't have a question. I'm George Kent, a longtime friend of both.
Yeah, good friend.
I grew up in Charleston.
All right.
Where this happened.
Right.
And it's our original sin. Going back to the Constitution, I missed your first 10 minutes. I didn't know where you start, but our Constitution, the original version, they figured the life value of a black life as 3/5, and that was so that the southern states could have more votes without giving blacks rights. And so I think that was something that it took 100 years for us to get to the point of having a civil war. It took another 100 years to pass the Civil Rights Act. And as Volodya said, we are still struggling with that. The way President Obama says it, in order to form a more perfect union, which is from our first documents, and we're still in that struggle to form a more just society for everybody. And so there's this dynamic tension between people who want to create a better society and people who are very happy to have a society that had elements of discrimination. So I think that it's not a creative or healthy tension, but it is a tension, and it's an issue that U.S. society continues, I think, to struggle with. But as Volodya said, there's a lot of progress. And I think what's remarkable for me, having spent so much time overseas, is looking at how quickly societal attitudes can change. In 2008, President Obama and Hillary Clinton, running for president for the Democratic Party, did not support gay marriage, and within the past year, a conservative majority on the court appointed by Republican presidents confirmed that that was considered constitutional. And institutionally, attitudinally, legally, that is tremendous progress, and I am actually surprised that on that set of issues, it moved so quickly. But I think that's part of any society's dialogue with values, and how do you put values in law, but also in practice in how people react to each other.
Thanks, George.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Maybe to reflect on what I've said, or I think it's an interesting way also, as George did, to have some kind of analogy or parallel with what's going on in Ukraine, because there are some, right? And like you said, it was both Maidans actually. It was 2004 and then 10 years later.
If we have no
It's a huge subject, obviously. I mean, as you can see, it could be the entire lecturing course on just this subject of history of civil rights in the U.S. And like George said, it's not just about African Americans. It's also about gays. It's also about women, because in this 1960s movement, the part of civil rights movement was also feminism, and women standing up to fight for their rights. Because in Civil Rights Act of 1964, actually, which President Johnson signed, it says the discrimination should be not based on color, or race, or sex, for that matter. And it was the beginning of a new era in the fight of women, American women, for their rights as well. So that's much bigger than just blacks and whites, and that's it's really about your human rights and civil rights, and that's why it matters. Yeah.
But do you know about movement Latin Americans?
Latin Americans. Oh yeah, they fought for their rights as well. I don't know that much about their movement for their rights as I do about African American civil rights movement, but they fought a lot. There was this major figure called Cesar Chavez, for instance, who was very much involved in organizing Latinos, and often, more often than not, they're getting together with African Americans in many ways, and that's how they vote. They vote similar in many ways. There are some different problems that they face. For instance, this illegal immigration issue is not an issue for African Americans because they've been there, their families, for centuries, really. For Latinos, it's different. But they get together in many ways, and that's that's an interesting subject. Without those votes, President Obama would probably not be becoming president. But interestingly and importantly enough, that without a lot of white votes, neither in 2008 or 2012, he would become an American president as well. So it's really about people changing their opinions. Like the example that George gave us about the LGBT cause, gays and others. That the country has been changing rapidly, so fast. You still have hate crimes and so on. You still have a growing number. Actually, I think there is a backlash. If you have a progress in a certain area, then you have someone who is using violence to attack those people. So it's actually a growing number of people who are gays who are attacked violently and sometimes killed in the U.S., even though we have this landmark Supreme Court decision on this subject and so on. So with Latinos, they're struggling for their rights. It's primarily the recognition right and also voter registration right, because if you're legally here, it means you don't have a document. You cannot really vote. How can you do that? You can do the amnesty for the Latinos, which is a highly debated issue now. Do you actually recognize all these people who are already de facto in the country as American citizens or not? You can try to distinguish what you do to people who came here illegally and their kids who are already born in the U.S. or they are American citizens. So they are being given all sort of help and assistance from on a local level, state level, but also federal level in terms of getting their education and so on. So it's a big issue,
Well, if I can just say something about that, it's many, I would say, white Americans and others may lump Latinos or use the term Hispanic just because their native language was Spanish. That hides the fact that they came from very diverse societies and very diverse social backgrounds. Most Cuban Americans describe themselves as Cuban Americans. They're not Hispanics, they're Cuban Americans. In the 70s, on the backbone of the sort of Chavez and organizing the agriculture workers, a term that you used to hear more than you do now was Chicanos, and that was specifically Mexican Americans. In the Washington, D.C. community, there are a lot of people from Central America, and they have nothing in common with Cuban and Mexican Americans except that Spanish was their native language. And even with that, coming from Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, they have their own little communities, and then South Americans as well. There's a big Bolivian population. They come to all the community dances, very colorful bands and dances, and so there may be some mixing of that into, if people call it Latina culture, Hispanic culture, but most people, at least that first generation, have much more of affinity, particularly Cuban Americans. And then rapidly that assimilation happens, and they've got heritage, and yet already that next generation, they are almost all English speakers, and they'll throw a couple Spanish words in depending on what their community is. So I think it really, I would say it's a mixed picture. Cuban Americans are among the highest educated and best paid ethnic groups in the States because it was the elite that left with money after the Castro takeover in Cuba. And so they look down. I mean, I'll say there was racism in Cuba to begin with, and they imported those attitudes when they came to Miami. And so I would say it's a very flexible dynamic. Most Latinos tend now to vote Democratic because the Republican Party has such a strong anti-immigrant perspective. But if you ask me who I think might be the Republican nominee for the presidency, my money would be on Marco Rubio, a Cuban American, proud Cuban American. So that's why I think it's tough to make simplistic assumptions, and because of the nature of immigration from countries whose first language was Spanish, that diversity oftentimes gets hidden.
Any other questions?
And when start white movement from discrimination.
For the Hispanics? You mean when was
White movement.
a white movement? Oh, right. Yeah, well, I guess in the middle of this century when they get to be a minority.
No, there are people. I think
Yeah.
Volodya described them, and particularly the touchstone issue. He mentioned affirmative action.
Right.
Oftentimes, when kids can't get into a competitive university, and that's a sort of touchstone. And then it's the legality and the morality of affirmative action is something that continues to be debated.
Yeah.
And is it fair to treat anybody as a group as
Right.
opposed to individually? You know, did that
That's
person do something wrong to be treated unfairly?
Yeah.
And then it's basically what it is that, as Volodya said, it's society, our society took a decision for positive discrimination to
Right.
make up for past other policies. But it's a live political issue. It's not a settled issue.
Right. Well, I don't know. Any other
So
questions?
with the story still evolving,
Yeah.
we'd like to thank everyone for coming. We hope that you will find us on Facebook. We're below this Kennan Institute Kyiv office. Please follow our announcements and you will know everything about our programming in Ukraine, about seminars, conferences, regional presentations that we organize. We would be very happy to see you again when the Kennan lecture series resume in 2016. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks. Thank you for coming. Дякую всім, що прийшли.